Hi, my name is Dr. Vera Tarman, and I am an addictions physician working out of Toronto, Canada. And today's lecture is going to be on the biology of recovery. If you haven't checked out my previous lecture on the biology of addiction, please watch that because that gives the neurochemistry and lots of good information about drugs and alcohol. This is the lecture where I talk more about the other factors. Once you've put down the drug and gone through the withdrawal, then how do you do the things that are required to maintain long-term sobriety? I'm going to focus on, in this lecture, three key pieces that are more in the psychological variety: stress management, sleep management, emotional regulation. These are all features that can disrupt a good long-term recovery platform. So I'm going to first of all start with stress. Stress is a really big issue. It's a big issue in the larger world, not just in the world of recovery and relapse prevention. It's a big issue across the board. And so we use this term stress. Now, when we're speaking about stress, what we're really talking about in terms of the biology of stress is adrenaline and the effects of adrenaline on the body. In the primal limbic system part of our brain, in the middle part of our brain, we have an organ that's called the amygdala. And the amygdala is like our panic button. And whenever we see something that is threatening in the environment, now that could be the external environment or the internal environment, my body will respond as in threat, as in danger. And so I will create what we know as the fight, flight, freeze response. Flight, I'm going to run away. Fight, well, if I can't run, I'll fight. And if I can't fight or run, then I'll freeze, and hopefully the predator won't notice. I want to remind you, this can be internal or external. That adrenaline response impacts the whole body, that fight, flight, freeze response, and is actually the contributor to many of our medical conditions today. Behind me, there's a diagram. Stress can cause all these symptoms. So it could be anything from that hot, flushed feeling to a dry mouth, to palpitations in your heart, to cravings for food, to cramps, stomach cramps or muscle cramps, hands that are cold and sweaty, biting your nails, feeling dizzy, grinding your teeth, tapping and not being able to sit still, all of these things, because it's basically your body preparing to fight, flight, or freeze. Any medical condition can cause stress. So diabetes can cause stress, depression can cause drug abuse, drug detox can cause stress. All of these things can cause stress because they all stimulate this adrenaline response. So a good recovery platform is to figure out, how do I manage my stress? How do I manage my adrenaline response? Because why is it that people use drugs often? Why do people drink? Why do people use benzodiazepines? Why do they use opiates? Often to manage stress because they haven't learned how to deal with their stress. I mentioned that stress can be internal and external, and typically we think of external, like there's the big man in the dark alleyway and now I'm stressed because I'm worried that I'll be hurt. But it can be internal stress too. And I'm just going to give you a list of a few of these things because they're actually very important. So the first one is loss of control. A lot of people will say, I am a control freak, because they're afraid that if they're not in control of things, they will be at risk because they're the only ones that are looking out for themselves. In the psychological literature, we call that the locus of control. And locus of control is super important. Of course, we know that you can be too much in control in areas where you can't be, which is the whole focus of the serenity prayer and a surrender, and that concept of I am not in control of everything in the world and I have to learn to surrender, sit back and let things happen. For sure, not surprisingly, very common in the addiction world where people are so focused on control. Use drugs often because you can control your drug, you can control how much you take, and presumably you can control the actual experience once you learn how to manage your drug use. So control is a pretty important thing in the addiction world. Now, this slide here shows a picture of a study, and this was done in the 1970s, and it's about the importance of control. It's a picture of looks like a nursing home or a hospital room. There's residents that are living here for a long time, And there's a flower in the window at the back. And this is the study. They had one half of the population, let's say one of the two beds here, that were filled with patients who were able to manage their plant. They were able to water the plant. They were able to move it around. They were able to, prune it. They were able to do whatever it was that they wanted to do with that plant. And then the other half of the population, maybe bed two, were the people who had no control over the plant other than that they could sit and enjoy the plant. The nurses would take care of the rest of it. And then they measured the cortisol levels, which is one of our stress hormones that I'll talk about shortly. And guess what they found? They found that the person with the higher stress, the higher cortisol level, was the person that had no control over that plant, where they don't have control over their decor. They don't have control over the food that they're eating, over the nurse that's there for the day. They have no control. All they had the control over was that one plant. And yet that insignificant little detail made a significant difference in level of cortisol that was shown. So locus of control is perception of control. It's not necessarily how much control the person has, but you have to feel that you have some control. Some control. You don't want to give up everything, but we often go too far and we want to control completely. And what we ask for in recovery and in stress management is find out where you have control. This is essentially the serenity prayer. Give me the courage to change the things I can. Where is my loci of control and where can I change it? And the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, and the wisdom to know the difference. The wisdom to know the difference. You don't need to have a lot, but you need to know how much. In this case, it's just the flower. This is actually an important piece of information to know when you're doing therapy, for example. Let's say you're trying to deal with trauma that's happened in the past. Most people who have experienced trauma continue to re-experience the trauma because somewhere in there's that belief. This is the adrenaline response, or the animal part of our brain that's saying, if this happened before, it can happen again. And I had no control then, and so I won't have control now. Therapy is often a way to find where can you find control that you had then or that you have now so that it won't happen again. And it doesn't have to be a big deal, a big feature. It just needs to be something. Well, I won't go in that neighborhood anymore. You want to find some level of control in that scenario so that you can put it to rest. Locus of control is an interesting concept and is actually one of the fundamental features of long-term recovery. Another one is excitement. And you may have heard that excitement goes through the same pathways as does fear. And here's an example. Here's a picture of someone who is she afraid or is she excited? We don't know because it truthfully is the same pathway. Another picture, is this person afraid or excited? Well, in this case, they look more afraid and, they're stage fright, but what are they actually afraid of? They would say, I'm afraid of the audience, but what they're really afraid of is their perception of what the audience thinks of them. They are responding as if there is literally some danger that is about to pounce upon them. Excitement, that's a dopamine-fueled experience, and we want to be excited, but at the same time, it's stressing our body because it's also going down the same pathways of fear. And if you're looking for constant excitement, you're putting your body under extreme duress or stress. Another source of stress is boredom. And a lot of people will say in addiction, I used because I got bored. And you can think, well, what is boredom? Why would boredom actually be a stressor? And if you think about it, boredom is the opposite of excitement. So there I am suggesting that you don't be excited all the time because it's exhausting, but you want to have some excitement because boredom, that's like a deficiency of dopamine. You're not getting the normal dopamine that you want in a day. My body is saying, Vera, you're not out there doing the things that you need to do to keep yourself alive, and it's going to make me feel uncomfortable. We want to be at a steady state of about it and use up our 100 units in a day. Boredom, that's a 60 or a 30 or a 20 or maybe a 0, and that's painful. It's almost like a version of depression. So boredom is a big stressor. And in recovery, we don't want to be bored. We want to do stuff. And, you can say, well, what do I do? Anything that entices your interest. So that could be starting to read, that could be going out and walking and talking to people, that could be starting to go back to your workplace, it could be going back to school. Pick up your curiosity and want to know what is going to happen next. So another issue might be your emotions. On the most common psychiatric disorders as of 2023. But just a word about post-traumatic stress disorder. There's a picture behind me, a World War I vignette. That time it was called shell shock, the experience of people who were in an environment that was where they were under constant threat. And when you're under constant threat, that's going to change your brain in some ways. One of the things that we found is that it doesn't have to be the one event. It can be multiple little events, constant. Like, for example, being in an abusive relationship where every evening you don't know if you're going to get hit or belittled or some version of threat. And what happens is your body goes into fight or flight mode almost consistently. Then, even if it's over, when that situation is over, you may still live with the memory of that event. And what you will have are the symptoms that are typical of post-traumatic stress, which is intense fear, of course, because you're responding to a potential life threat, hypervigilance, which is where even when there's no threat there, you're scanning the environment, looking for it. You have inappropriate responses like rage, which to your body, they don't feel like inappropriate responses. And you'll have even intrusive thoughts just sitting there, and all of a sudden you thinking, oh my gosh, I better be ready for this. I forgot. I can't forget, because it could happen at any moment. And that could happen even when you're in sleep, which is nightmares. So this is like a hyper state of being ready to fight or flight. In our brain, what's very interesting is that our memory in the hippocampus, it always registers the most extreme of good or bad. And that would make sense, because a slight annoyance in the day, I might remember that for that day, but the next day I'm going to forget about it. And in a week, I won't even remember what I was annoyed about, because it was never really life-threatening. In my mind, it might have been bigger than the actual situation called for, but I wasn't actually frightened. But if I was really, truly frightened, the brain is going to register, wow, we can't let Vera forget this because it's dangerous, and we want to be ready for the next time. It's like we've learned from our environment that this is something that's dangerous, and so our brain won't forget the highly intense times, which is unfortunate for somebody struggling with post-traumatic stress, because it may be that where they will never be back into that circumstance again, like they were, in the Vietnam War. Well, they're not going to be called to war again. So why would they need to be hyper-vigilant now? There are no bombs flying in that particular environment where they live. They don't need to worry about it anymore, but their brain is still prepared for it. And so what do we do in that circumstance? We try to desensitize that, because we don't need to be on hyper alert. Essentially, people do it through drugs and alcohol. Well, they numb the experience. So let's talk a little bit about stress in terms of what are the symptoms, and then how do you know how stressed you are. So here's a stress quiz of 10 questions. Number 1, do you feel constantly fatigued mentally or physically? Now notice I'm not asking, do you feel stressed? Do you feel constantly fatigued? Of course, fatigue can be many other things. It could be the foods that you're eating, but certainly stress is a key feature. Do you find that activities and hobbies that you used to enjoy are no longer appealing? Do you get sick or feel headaches, stomach aches more than usual? Because where does stress manifest itself but in the body? Have you lost or gained a certain amount of weight without really knowing why? Because stress is extremely demanding on our energy reserves. Do you dread tomorrow instead of looking forward to it? Because normally, in normal life, our dopamine, that 100 that we walk around with every day, makes us look forward to things. What's going to happen? What's the next Netflix that I'm going to watch? What's the next book that I can read? Looking forward to something as opposed to dreading something. Constantly worrying about things like your job, your relationship, even when you're supposed to be relaxing and having fun. Like, for example, the person who's on holiday and can't stop looking at work. Even while they're on the train, supposedly looking at the beautiful mountains. Do you feel that no matter how much work you do, you can never get it done? Well, in the same line, it's exhausting to be in that state of mind, and you never get a break, and so you always feel like there's just never enough time to do anything. Do you actually feel hopeless about your future? Do you often feel more emotional about things? And do you feel easily annoyed or angered? You can say yes to those 10 questions. Even if you can say yes to more than 4 or 5 of those questions, I'm going to suggest that you're probably more stressed than is good for you. There's actually a term that's called subjective units of distress. And this is a continuum that is used often in trauma therapy. And the idea there is that we want to measure a person's level of stress, either from 1, which is super chill, no stress, to 10, I am so stressed, I can't stand it. The argument here is that we are best at around a 3 or a 4. Remember, excitement is the same pathway as the stress, the fear response. And so we want to be about a 3 or a 4 throughout the day. That's maybe like that 100 units of dopamine that keeps us going. But we don't want to be more because it's too exhausting. We're around a 3 or a 4. That's life-sustaining, that's life-invigorating. More important for therapy, it's also we're not so emotionally charged in our brain that we can't utilize our frontal lobe. If you watch the video where I talk about willpower, you'll see that when we are so enraged or intoxicated, we're not able to use our frontal lobe. And it's our frontal lobe that actually does our healing in a therapy context. The therapist doesn't do the healing. The therapy itself doesn't do the healing. It just sets the framework for me to be at around a 3 or a 4. And then with the guidance of the therapist, I'm able to use my own tools of wisdom, compassion for another person, of forgiveness for myself, of reframing the situation. All of these tools that we use in therapy, they come from the frontal lobe. And I cannot access those tools when I am freaked out on a 10 out of 10, because our emotional regulation works such that, we have the frontal lobe and we have the limbic system, which is in the middle part of the brain. And when I am emotionally charged, that limbic system is so charged, it's going up and up and up, and my frontal lobe, my thinking goes down, 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 down. And if I am less excited, my frontal lobe is able to actually rule the show, and then I can use those tools. So if we can be around a here, 3 out of 10, frontal lobe can do its job. I don't want to be too chill, because then the frontal lobe's like, I'm happy. Why would I pay attention to do anything? Because I'm okay the way I am. If you're at a 3 or 4, that's enough for the frontal lobe to take notice, get interested, but not super challenged and frightened, because then emotions go up and the ability to do those tools goes down. So you want to be, like I said, around a 3 or 4 out of that continuum from 0 to 10. That's an ideal state. But if you're at a 10, look what happens. You're going to get all sorts of symptoms like diarrhea and shakes and sweats. All of these things are thanks to that adrenaline response. So let's look at the biology of the adrenaline response so that you can understand it. It's very interesting. First of all, we have the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. And the central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord. And the peripheral nervous system is all the nerves that are that go down my shoulders and my body and my hands and my feet. And when we talk about having sciatica, that's a peripheral nervous problem. When we talk about having a headache, central nervous problem. In the central nervous system, which of course governs the peripheral nervous system, there's another distinction that we can make. We can make the distinction between what's called the voluntary nervous system and the involuntary nervous system. And the voluntary nervous system is when I choose to do something, like I'm moving, that's my voluntary nervous system. I choose to walk, I'm choosing to talk. Involuntary nervous system is the nervous system that governs my digestion, my breathing. We have an involuntary system that kind of runs the show, and I don't need to be aware of it. And in that involuntary system, and this is an important thing to know, it's involuntary. I don't have a choice. It happens whether I think about it or not. We have another distinction, and here's where stress sits. We have what's called the sympathetic nervous system, which is the stress response. Now, oddly, it's called sympathetic. It should not be called that because you think stress is not sympathetic, but anyway, it is. Sympathetic nervous system, that's the stress response. And then we have the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the relaxation response, or the non-stress response. Easier just to remember it as the relaxation response. Sympathetic stress response, parasympathetic relaxation response. So let's just call it the stress response and the relaxation response. These are both involuntary and they're both equally powerful. And so when I'm stressed, one part is charged up and the other part is sitting back. And when I'm not stressed, the relaxation response is up and running, and then the stress response is not working. So it's one or the other. Our body is wired that when danger, always, 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 the stress response will win. It never sits back when there's danger. And that danger can be just a stupid thought in my head and perceived threat, not a real threat, a perceived threat. Relaxation response is in the background and it's not doing, it can't fight, because if I'm in danger and I want to fight and flight, I don't want to be chilled and meditating and grooving on music. I want to be running for my life. So the stress response will always win out. When we're in an environment where we're living under constant stimulation that's potentially threatening, we're going to be in the stress response a lot of the time. The sympathetic response, involuntary. I don't have a choice. For example, how do I know when I'm stressed or if somebody else is stressed? I can look at their pupils. And this is often a way that you can tell if somebody's lying. And it's true. This is like, there are people who learn how to read body language to tell if a person's lying or not. And one of the things they're going to look at is their pupil. Why? Because when you are stressed, your pupils dilate. Why? Because you want to be able to see the environment. And interestingly, when you take a stimulant, which puts you in a stress response, guess what happens? Pupils dilate. That's how you know if somebody's high on a stimulant. Look at their pupils. It's a dead giveaway right there. So that's a pupils dilating. Then the next one is the salivary glands get dry. And notice when you go to talks and there's the lectern and the person speaking, they're always offered, do you want some water? That's an acknowledgement to, it's kind of stressful being up there, especially if you have stage fright. And so you have water because your salivary glands, your mouth is getting dry, so you have water to get a little bit of wet so you can talk. When you are stressed, your breathing becomes very short and shallow and fast. Panting, because what are they doing? They're preparing to run. They're wanting to get as much oxygen into their lungs as possible, which can then go to the brain and fuel their ability to run or fight. So you end up having short, shallow breaths. Your heart rate goes up because the heart wants to pump as much of that oxygenated air from your panting to the brain as quickly as possible. So you get a heart rate. It's all in the service of making you be able to run or fight. Your stomach, notice when you're really, really anxious, you don't want to eat, or what you have eaten feels like a rock in your gut. I remember when I used to speak publicly, I learned never have a full meal before, even if it means you're going to be hungry while you're talking. Don't, because that fullness will feel so uncomfortable. Why? Because essentially what happens is your body is deciding, I want to put all my effort into the breathing and the heart rate, and I don't need to eat right now. I don't have time to eat right now. That's called rest and digest. That belongs to the other part over this side here. It belongs to the relaxation response. You don't want to be eating. In fact, if you've got any food in there and it's like this lump, you know what? I might even defecate, get rid of it. Diarrhea, let's get it out of my body because I don't have time to deal with it. I've got to run, and which means I need to focus my energy on my muscles and my breathing, not on my stomach. The next point is that the liver will actually produce more sugar. And I don't know if you've heard this before, where stress will actually make you pre-diabetic, or if you're a diabetic, it makes your sugars worse. If you're trying to lose weight, you don't want to be stressed too much because the liver is, you don't need to eat the sugar. By the way, you're going to have more cravings for sugar because you want more fuel for that brain. You don't have any on board. Your body, thankfully, your liver will make that fuel so that you can run or fight. So you actually create glucose on your own. Urinating, you'll notice, especially some of you, that you urinate more. Now, you don't urinate a lot, but you urinate frequently. Again, it's the same idea as the diarrhea. Get rid of the excess baggage. You don't have a lot of time, so get rid of it quickly, diarrhea, or with frequent urination. Whenever you can, get rid of it. To the point where some people are going, when they're stressed, like 3 times an hour. Another one is muscles. And you may not realize how stressed you are except by the soreness. People don't realize, if you do this, you don't realize that you're doing this until later, where you feel the fatigue and the cramp, be in the shoulders or in the back, head. It's a chronic tension of, I'm ready to fight, or I'm ready to run. On the other side, we have the relaxation response. And here's where the pupils contract. If you want to know if somebody's relaxed, again, look for the pupils. If they say, hey, I'm super relaxed and their pupils are dilated, I would actually myself wonder, well, are they high on something? Or are they maybe not telling me the truth? Now, you can take a drug that will contract your pupils. Classically, that would be an opiate. When the pupils are contracted, that's usually a sign that they're super chill, either medically or just realistically. The next thing is saliva. Think about when you're about to fall asleep and you're relaxing and your mouth starts to drool, that's a sign that you're relaxing. Because what's happening is the body is getting ready to do the rest and digest. Your stomach is starting to gurgle. It wants to digest that food. So all of the salivary, like the drool and the stomach, is all ready to digest that food. Your heart rate goes down. It doesn't need to be pounding, and that's a very good thing. That's why when you are asked to do a blood pressure, the doctor will say, can you lay down in the dark for 3 minutes and then check your blood pressure? That would be a more accurate mark of what the status of your vessels are, as opposed to that stress response that's contracting the vessels. You can be so relaxed that you can get constipated. Now, I've never heard of somebody that's so relaxed because of yoga getting constipated, but if you're taking a drug that will relax you, constipation is often the end result of that. Now, I said this was involuntary. We have that stress response, which always wins the moment you have a stressful thought in your mind. Let's call it a threatening thought in your mind. It will always win. But there is one way to help that poor relaxation response to get some edge, and that is by breathing. So it's still involuntary, but breathing will help kick the parasympathetic response, that relaxation response. This is why when you do yoga, when you do any kind of relaxation work, even when you do therapy, we're asked to take a deep breath, and that might be an actual practice of breathing or just a consciousness of taking a deep breath. Think about when a person smokes a cigarette, which is a highly stimulating event. Nicotine is stimulating, but is a deep breath. And believe it or not, that deep breath almost counters the effect of the stimulating effect of the nicotine. It's an interesting thing. That's why when a person has a cigarette and they come back, they go, oh, I feel better now. I feel more relaxed, because they actually had, how many deep breaths is in a whole cigarette? Probably about 10 deep breaths. They have actually essentially put themselves into relaxation. And how does that work? When I take a deep breath from deep into my belly, basically right down, I'm not taking a short, shallow breath, which is the panting response, but the deep breath, that is stimulating the diaphragm. We call it diaphragmatic breathing. It's stimulating the diaphragm. My lungs, my air is touching the diaphragm, and the diaphragm is where the parasympathetic nerve can get stimulated. So when I take a deep breath, it's like turning on the switch for the parasympathetic nerve. Now, people will say when they're stressed, I can't deep breathe when I'm stressed, because they want to pant. They want, how can I breathe when I'm panting? But if you ask them, do it anyway, as much as you can, force the breath in. And by the time you get to breath 6, the first couple will be short because you're still in pant mode, but then by the 4th or the 5th or the 6th, you're getting deeper and deeper, touching that diaphragm. And by the time you're at 10 or maybe 20 deep breaths, you are in the land of relaxation response. So that is a way that we can voluntarily turn on the involuntary relaxation response, which is why breathing is so important. And that stress response, if you're in that all the time, it affects the whole body. As I've just shown you, it affects the eyes, the liver, the muscles, the bladder. It affects the whole body, and long-term effect as well. So the adrenaline response is the acute, immediate response. There's danger, and my adrenal glands will pump out adrenaline and keep it going. But if I'm in a chronic state of an adrenalized response, I have a secondary hormone called cortisol, and cortisol will allow me to maintain that stress response. So cortisol gives more glucose. If there's any injury, because that's more likely to happen, it will repair the injury as much as possible. It will contain inflammation. That's why we give cortisone shots when we have an inflamed knee or a painful hip. And ensures that our body stays in that adrenaline mode where we focus on fight, flight, and not on non-essentials like rest and digestion. That's good when you're in threat and you need to respond to the threat. But over the long term, not good. Too much cortisol causes all sorts of terrible medical conditions. For example, muscle pain and muscle strain, heart disease, high blood pressure, stroke. I mean, it allows you to stay in stress mode and, weight gain because you're pumping out all that glucose that you're not even eating. Your body's just making it for you. The other thing that chronic stress will do is it will set our mind into anxiety mode. So the anxiety is perpetuated by, we have this organ in the middle of our brain that's called the amygdala, and you can see it's the little red thing right there. It's in the middle of the brain, and it's our fear response. How it works is that a child in this particular picture image sees somebody who's in distress, and the message of fear, because if she's in distress, there must be distress out there. I don't see it, but she sees it, and therefore I'm forewarned. And so that warning is a threat that will go to my amygdala, and I will kick off the adrenal response even before it goes to my frontal lobe, and I'm aware, there's something going on. This woman is upset. This is why when you walk into a room with somebody shouting and angry, or there's a lot of noise, you get already tense and ready to run, even before you can tell yourself, oh my God, they're upset, but it's not at me. I don't need to be threatened. They're not mad at me. They're mad at somebody else. But that animal part of me is already ready to run because there's danger in the environment. If it's dangerous for somebody else, it could be dangerous for me. And my frontal lobe is seconds later. It can't control the show anymore. And so that's the amygdala. And when you're in stress response, that amygdala is constantly charged, not just with the one threat. Oh, she's upset. And then I realize she's not upset and it's gone after 20 minutes, because that's usually how long fear lasts, just like cravings, by the way, about 20 minutes. Then I can settle. But a constant barrage of negative thoughts in my head, I'm a bad person, or so-and-so is going to yell at me because I have this thing that's going on tomorrow and I'm nervous about it and I think about it all day. I'm in stress all day as I constantly let these daggers of threat spear that amygdala, if I can continue that analogy. And my frontal lobe just can't get in there to say, don't do this. I mean, that's part of what recovery tools are, is to say, here you are in a stressful mode, settle, breathe, take 20 minutes, stop thinking, stop paying attention to the stressors, get away from the people who are yelling and shouting and causing you grief, so that you can basically climatize yourself. Because remember, when you're highly emotional, that frontal lobe is high emotion, frontal lobe is down here. You want to be able to de-stress yourself so that your frontal lobe comes up and then can give you that perspective that you need. So this is the amygdala. And if you're constantly in stress mode, which is what anxiety does, the frontal lobe never gets up for air to give you that perspective. Anxiety is not a pleasant feeling, nor is it supposed to be a pleasant feeling. Because if there is a saber-toothed tiger running at my body, I don't want to be feeling good. I want to be feeling uncomfortable so that I am motivated to get away from that danger. Insomnia, how are you going to be able to sleep? You're going to have all these mood disorders, including cravings for sugar. And this is just because of stress. So you can see how you're going to choose to use drugs and alcohol, because often they are ways to contain your stress. And when you stop using, you got to do something or you're going to pick up again. It's going to be a cause for relapse. So in recovery, we need to have a way to manage our emotional regulation. What is recovery? Here's a picture behind me. I love this picture. The lion in the background who's chill. That's the limbic system. He's chill. We want to chill that lion. If that lion is raging, that lamb sitting below him is going to be running away. But when that lion is chill, the lamb gets to sit there contentedly and be as cute and sweet as possible. And what is that lamb but our frontal lobe, our intellect, our ability to care for others, our ability to care for ourselves, our ability to be rational and reasonable and all that kind of stuff. We want to chill the whole thing out. And how do we do that? First, we have to tame the wild beast, and then the frontal lobe will follow. Because the lion will always win out, and the lion is the stress response. We got to calm the stress response and then nourish the relaxation response. How do we get into a stress-free zone? You've heard of cognitive therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy. These are all ways to take these stressful thoughts that we have, question those negative stressful thoughts that are stimulating the sympathetic stress response, adrenaline response in our body, and questioning them. We have to recognize that we have them because we may not know. We just think that's the truth, and recognize, no, it's not the truth. It's my version of the truth. And let's question my story. And then can we reframe it in some way so that it's less stressful? Cognitive therapy has been found to be very successful for anxiety, for depression, even for things like insomnia, for eating disorders. It's very helpful because those are really just reactions to our adrenaline response, which is our reaction to a threat, a perceived or real threatening environment. Just a word for the 12-step program. This is step 4 and 5. This is where you take the resentments, the baggage, the emotional baggage that you've been carrying throughout your life, which could be, my father beat me, my mother didn't love me, I beat my wife, I hate myself. All of those things are just ripe to get you back into relapse mode if you continue to believe and carry them. These are also, they're highly stressful. They are sticking needles into that amygdala for you and causing you in a highly stressed response. You want to get rid of those thoughts. Use them to tell you what it is you need to work with. It means you have to face them and confront them. Yeah, that's what I'm upset about. I'm upset about my father. I'm upset about my mother. I'm upset about my own behavior in particular times in my life. And then now that I know what that is, I'm now going to change. This is essentially what step 4 does. Is what are the issues that have been plaguing me? What is my part in it? Remember, loci of control. What can I do? And what do I need to let go of? And once you figure out all of that, you are essentially working through that stress response so that you come out on the other side feeling like that's no longer a lump of baggage or stone that I'm carrying on my back. It might still be something, but much less. We want to diminish the negative thoughts, which then lead to a stress response. Because if you don't, I've said this already a couple of times in this class, if you don't, you're going to do your own version of stress management, which is often drugs and alcohol. Because what do drugs and alcohol do? They stop the thinking. There's that lobotomy, do-it-yourself lobotomy. You're actually closing off the frontal lobe, which is where all those negative thoughts are coming from. I'm a bad person. I'm a this. I mean, they're ritualized, routine thoughts that is constantly sticking needles in the amygdala. You're going to want to turn that off sometimes. And that's what drugs and alcohol do. So when you stop the drugs and alcohol, you have to find another way. We'll say a couple of words about medication here. I do have a whole other couple of classes on medication, but I'm going to say here that there are a couple of medications that are used to quell the stress response. There are the benzodiazepines. They kind of flatten, muffle those thoughts, those cognitive thoughts that are not doing you well. You essentially lose your ability to be as vicious, basically, because you're kind of putting yourself into a chill mode. In the more longer term, what people will sometimes use are some medications that are actually made for an antihypertensive, like prazosin. What they really do is they nullify the stress response. Apparently, people who are musicians or actors will sometimes take them because they don't want to take a drug or drink that will kind of fog their brain up. They just want to not feel that physical response to stress. They still want the acute awareness of the stress, like the heightened awareness that comes with stress, but they don't want the shakes and the sweats and the tremble and the dry voice or trembly voice and the dry mouth. And so they take prazosin as a means to kind of mitigate that. It is often used for post-traumatic stress as well. And it's used classically in 2 ways. One for nightmares, because there you are sleeping happily and you get a bad dream. And the prazosin, which is typically used, is not actually taking away the nightmare, but it's taking away the response of the nightmare. So that you wake up, you have the nightmare, but it's like, oh yeah, right. It's not like, oh my God, it's that nightmare again. Oh, I'll just go back to bed. Like, you don't have quite the same dramatic response. And so then you can carry on and actually process the work. So we can use it actually through therapeutic, like post-traumatic stress work. We can actually use it so that the person can work through this stuff. Remember that 3 out of 10. You don't want to be more than a 3 or 4 out of 10, because if you're too high, you can't use your frontal lobe to help you heal yourself. And similarly, the medication allows you to be in that 3 or 4 out of 10. First focus, as I said, quell the stress response. mitigate it, modify it, push it down. When the emotional response is less, like I said, my ability to use my frontal lobe goes up. So quell that. And then the other thing is, can I nourish the parasympathetic response, that relaxation response? And how do I do that? Number one, breathe, diaphragmatic breathing, turn that parasympathetic response on. And the next thing we do in a meditative response is we have a thought. Often it's a mantra or a positive affirmation, something. The brain can only do one thing at one time. I know we think we can do multitasking, but really and truthfully, at one particular time, comfortably, we can do one thing at a time. So if I'm constantly thinking, oh, or God is in and bad feelings go out, I'm thinking something, I'm not able to have all those crazy thoughts interrupt because I'm focusing on something. So I'm saying, you know what, my brain is taking space to do positive thought. You can say, well, those are false, they're not real. Who cares? They are, at that moment, you are putting yourself in that space, and then nothing else can penetrate because you're putting yourself intentionally in that space. And if you're anxious, do the breathing, which will quell some of that anxiety. So you're fostering that parasympathetic relaxation response by giving safety. If you believe in God, if you have any kind of positive faith in the universe, allow that as well. Enveloped in this warm, fuzzy, God is good, no matter what happens, I'll be strong enough. There's a purpose to everything that happens to me. I'm in a meeting and people all know how I feel. You're filling yourself up with something positive, allowing that part of your brain to operate. These are all essential ingredients that you will read about in recovery platforms. And this is the biology behind it. You are fostering the parasympathetic response, which will finally get a chance to give you the perspective and healing that you need. This is why they say that spirituality is often a good indicator of long-term satisfied recovery. What is it doing? It's giving you a benign, safe environment of the universe. Instead of living in a threatened world, you don't have to believe it even. If you just put yourself into that, we often say, act yourself into the right thinking. You just put yourself into that place because it will then dampen that amygdala, which is the threat response. The good news is the more you do that, the more the neurons that fire together, wire together, the more you start developing different patterns of neuronal activity, different pathways in the forest, as it were, that will support a more chill, less threatening thought environment. And they've actually shown through various studies, Tibetan monks, Carmelite nuns, that they have enhanced frontal lobe, which is that part of our brain that we need to get that perspective to feel better. It's that ability then to restrain our emotions. It enhances that. Through the activity of the parasympathetic or relaxation response. You'll probably recognize some of these tools as tools that you've seen in recovery: hypnosis, guided visualizations, meditation, prayer. These are all ways to allow you to go into that place. The other thing that's important is fellowship in recovery. And we hear about that all the time. So the 12-step program is always saying, go to meetings, get a sponsor, get service, do all these things. And there is a very valid biological reason for this. So let me talk about that now. In my previous talks, I've talked about serotonin, dopamine, and endorphin. And mainly I've talked about dopamine because dopamine is the neurochemical of addiction. That's the sort of mother lode of addiction. The others are certainly involved, but dopamine is the one that most people have studied, and that's where most of our understanding comes from. There's a dopamine impairment syndrome. There's an overabundance of dopamine and then the response of that. But in recovery, what we're trying to do actually is focus on serotonin. You've heard of the phrase, the opposite of addiction is connection. So addiction, the opposite of addiction, too much dopamine, is connection. And where do we get the connection? Not from dopamine. No, the dopamine we want to flatten down. It's kind of like stress. We want to kind of right size it. We need stress. We need dopamine, but only 3 or 4 out of 10, not 10 or 20 out of 10. We need to right size it, and we want to maximize the relaxation response, and we want to maximize the serotonin response, because both of those we can live in luxuriously for the whole day without any difficulty. The body loves us being in that healthy multiplayer. And serotonin is our neurochemical of connection, of safety, of satisfaction, not excitement and thrill and achievement, but I have achieved. I have gotten what I need. I am satisfied. I am social. It's at the end of the day, it's the nest, it's the family. I've done all my hunting and gathering, that's dopamine. And now I'm at the end of the day where I'm accumulating it all. And I'm just so happy that I did all that stuff. I had a good full day of work. I feel very satisfied. I feel very accomplished with people around me. They love me. I love them. That's all serotonin. And a lot of recovery is based on fellowship and service and gratitude, which is serotonin. The opposite of addiction is connection. Normal part of life is you want to go out and do, get up in the morning and do, that's dopamine. At the end of the day, you want the serotonin to have done and be satisfied. And what happens with addiction is the dopamine is bloated out and the serotonin is so crushed down. Now in recovery, we want to flatten the dopamine and flush out the serotonin. That's the goal. The best way to turn on serotonin is gratitude. Just feel grateful about the fact that it's a beautiful sunny day, that there are flowers, that you're able to move, anything, it doesn't matter. We have the ability to feel gratitude, and that's where our serotonin germinates. So far I've talked about the stress response and the relaxation response and how they are essentially the backstory behind a lot of recovery techniques that we use to maintain sobriety. Now I want to talk about one more big issue, and that is sleep. Sleep is super important. We can't close a talk without talk about sleep. So the first question I want to ask is, how much sleep do we actually need? An adult, certainly when you're younger, you require a lot more sleep, but as an adult, how much do we actually need? So if you're an infant, you need a lot of sleep. You need like 16 to 20 hours of sleep. And you know what? That sleep is important. When a baby is sleeping, they're not just doing nothing but sleep. There's actually a lot of brain formation happening. They're in what's called REM sleep, and a lot of neurological development is happening. As the child gets a little bit older, the requirements are less, but still quite high. And then by the time the person is a teenager, they still require a lot of sleep because there's still brain development happening, like a lot of brain development. You know, in early days, in infancy, it's about, how to talk and walk and move. In teenage, it's how to set boundaries, how to emotionally regulate, how to interact with people. Those are crucial goals, a lot of frontal lobe skills. And so you need a lot of sleep for that too. So adults don't need as much sleep, but we still need 7.5 to 8 hours. Some people it can be 9 hours, and some people it can be 6 hours, but it should be at least 6 hours. If you don't sleep, a lot of things happen, including accidents. So 2 to 4 times the risk of accident for a sleep-deprived person. A lot of accidents have happened because the driver was just falling asleep. Even disasters like 3 Mile Island or the Challenger were attributed to lack of sleep or not enough sleep. So what is it about sleep that's so important? The best way to say this is that there are physical consequences to lack of sleep, and there are mental consequences to lack of sleep. But let's look at the sleep structure first of all. It's very useful to know about the sleep structure because there are often 2 things that people tell me when they talk about their problem sleeping, which we will call insomnia. They'll say, number 1, I can't get to sleep. I just can't get to sleep, and therefore I've got a problem and I need my drugs or alcohol or medication. And then the other one they'll say is, well, I can get to sleep, but I keep waking up in the middle of the night. And like I wake up 4 or 5 times in the middle of the night, and that's a problem. And what I want to say to them, to the second point, is actually waking up in the middle of the night 4 or 5 times is normal. But if you can't get to sleep once you've woken up, it's a problem. So if you can fall asleep easily and then wake up in the middle of the night a few times, but then fall right back to sleep, it's not a problem. We have a natural cycle of about 1 to 1.5 hours of sleep. And if you're going to sleep 7 hours, well, that leaves 3 or 4 cycles of sleep. But what happens is that when you come up and wake up, you're not supposed to fully awake, but just be slightly awake, just to make sure your environment is safe, okay, it's all good. It's not too hot. It's not too cold. There's not a predator standing right there about to eat me. So therefore, I can go right back to sleep and there's no stress. But of course, if you have stressful thoughts waiting, like, oh my God, what will I do in the morning when I get up? So-and-so is going to get mad at me, or I have to go to work and I hate my job. Then of course, the stressful thought will wake you right up. Let's go back to the first cause of insomnia, which is I can't get to sleep. So we have these stages of sleep, and the first stage, the awake stage, and the awake stage is, it's when we're awake during the day, and also when we're trying to get to sleep at night. It is the stage where we are alert and hypervigilant and watchful. So if I'm paying attention to something somebody's saying, I'm in stage 1. I'm paying attention. If I'm working at a job where I have to be constantly paying attention, then I'm in stage 1. It is actually somewhat of a stressful state to be in for a long period of time, but it's our alert stage. And if you're sleeping or falling asleep, you spent the whole day avoiding your issues because you were busy eating or talking to people, watching TV, watching Netflix, whatever it was, and now you're alone at night in your own head by yourself, and those thoughts, nothing to distract you, and now you're thinking those thoughts, of course you're going to be awake. Stage 2 is where you move into what we call the beta phase. It's the relaxation. Remember, the sympathetic is the first stage, and the parasympathetic or the relaxation response is 2. I am relaxing. I'm starting to drift. And if somebody watching TV or driving a car, they're awake, but they're kind of almost in a trance. They're letting themselves go in, and things are closing off around them, and they're focusing into this. This is almost like a semi-hypnotic state. It's actually an ideal state. This is where we seek when we try to get into meditation. Perfect state. And in terms of 1 or 2, we actually want to be more in 2 throughout the day than in 1. Like 70% of the time, I would say, it depends on you. I like 70% and 20-30% of the alert stage, because the alert stage is very exhausting. And a lot of people use drugs and alcohol to get from 1 to 2. But you can do that. You can get to 1 to 2 without drugs and alcohol by meditation, hypnosis, deep breathing, taking a long walk, just not thinking, all of those tools. Stage 3 is light sleep. And light sleep is where you still hear the person snoring, you still hear, like in the room beside you, you still hear the noise of the cars outside, but you don't care anymore. You're letting go. You're drifting and starting to let go into your own state. It's a very nice state. And when we do meditation, and especially hypnosis, we seek to get people into 2 and 3. Stage 4 is called deep sleep, restorative sleep. This is where physical health is dependent upon. If I don't get to stage 4, I'm going to have high blood pressure, my diabetes is going to get worse, or I'm going to put myself into a pre-diabetic state if I'm eating junk food as well. This is the stage where you will wake up and somebody will say, there was a fire alarm, you didn't hear it? And you say, no, I didn't hear it. You are out, completely out. You don't hear a thing, you're completely out. We want to have at least 2 of those in a night, at least 2. So that might be 3 hours of restorative sleep. It's really crucial. The animal part of us doesn't want us to be there too long, because we're not going to hear if the predator who's outside is going to come in. We want to be ready for them, so or be alert of danger. So we don't stay there for very long. We go there, we kind of nourish ourselves there, and then we start to go up. And now we're going up to awake again, but not quite awake, more in stage 2, slightly stage 1, because you just want to touch base to make sure everything is safe. And then all safe, you go back down for another run of that restorative sleep. As you're going up to a stage 1 and to touch base, you're going through the last stage, which you could call stage 5, but we just call REM, R-E-M, rapid eye movement. And why do we call it rapid eye movement? Because rapid eye movement is where the eyes are moving, but the rest of my motor ability is paralyzed. Because if I could move, I would get up and run away from whatever it is that I'm dreaming. Like I would literally sleepwalk or do whatever it is. So often sleepwalking, sleep talking, sleep eating are a disorder of a combo of stage 4 and REM sleep. So REM is where we dream, and REM is crucial for basically 2 things: memory and for mood. So what happens in REM is that we're allowed through dream behavior and the activity that's happening in dream behavior, we're allowed to it's almost like sort out what happened in the day and throw out what's unnecessary. And this is both for mood and for memory. So we'll start with memory. So if something has happened and that wasn't that important, I'm not going to remember it. And if something was important, like somebody said, you got to remember to do this because you have to do this tomorrow, I want to remember it. And it's in REM sleep that I'm going to do the work of remembering. Often when we remember things, images from the past, something that happened when I was a child, whatever it is I want to remember right now in the future or in the present, and attaches it like a sticky from the past memory to the new memory. It's stuck and now I will remember it. But it's often through a bizarre story. Like, I'm thinking about, I want to get a dog and I've got, the thoughts about the dog and what I'm going to do. And then I have a dream about some dog that I knew 20 years ago. And there's something about that will stick. And so I'll have this dream about an old dog and the new dog, or an old environment and a new environment, and that will help me remember. That is REM sleep. And if I don't have enough of that REM sleep, I'm not going to have memory. And I often tell people if they have an exam, don't study all night and then expect to walk in and remember everything the next morning. Study like crazy the day before, and then let the night glue it all into the pieces so that you'll remember it, not only for the exam, but for later on afterwards. So REM is very, very powerful for memory. Second thing it's really powerful for is for mood. If you had a bad day, how many times have you heard somebody say, sleep on it and you'll feel better? You feel better the next day because your inner therapist, as it will, in that subconscious part of your brain, is able to fix up the problem. I don't know how it does it. I often tell people, you know what? Take an issue as an intention. I want to think about this, and I'm not going to think anymore because that's often gets me stressed out. But I'm just going to put it out there, and I'm going to trust that my REM, my inner dream, will somehow in the next morning intuitively make me feel better, like our inner therapist. That's a normal sleep cycle. And how we can get messed up is if we're stuck in the first part, stage one, and we cannot relax. And so then we take drugs or alcohol, which will get us past steps 1 and 2 and move us into 3 and maybe into 4. And that's why those things work. That's why benzodiazepines work so well. That's why alcohol works so well. That's why opiates work so well. The problem is that they're not good long-term solutions. Here's how we get into trouble. First of all, we become dependent on using them to get through to stage 4, which is what we need. And then we don't use the tools that we could otherwise use that are healthier. That's one. You're losing sight of tools that you could otherwise use. Plus, you're using those drugs that will actually, alcohol and benzodiazepines specifically, will erode the sleep structure, especially stage 4. So you'll get to stage 4, but you won't have much of it to stay in, not enough that you need. And so you end up having that feeling where you slept for 9 hours and you literally did sleep for 9 hours. It's not like you kept trying to fall asleep. You did. You were out. But you didn't actually have enough stage 4, so you still feel tired. You don't feel refreshed. Stage 4 is the refreshed feeling, and REM is the I feel better feeling. And if you don't have that, it's because you didn't get enough of those. And drugs and alcohol will erode those. They will erode those, especially stage 4. Do you know that if you don't get enough sleep, you can actually die? You need to have sleep. Sleep deprivation is a form of torture. If you're not getting sleep, your body is going to detect threat and you're going to get into a stress response. So that closes up our talk. I talked about the stress response, the relaxation response, and the importance of right-sizing, minimizing the stress response in recovery, maximizing, flourishing, embellishing the relaxation response, and making sure sleep is part of that process. And all of the tools that you will see in addiction treatment follow these biological principles. I hope you found this talk useful. Thank you.